we'll get started. I will go ahead and turn over the screen, the microphone, to Tara Kennedy, our Vice President.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again for joining us for this afternoon session. It is my pleasure to introduce Lily Lee. She is an artist joining us today born in Pullman, Washington, and she earned her BFA and BA from the University of Washington and an MFA in studio art from the University of Oregon in 2012. Lee has exhibited her work in the Ukraine, Portugal, Hungary, Italy, and Greece, and in numerous exhibitions throughout the United States, including the Northwest Art Now at the Tacoma Art Museum and the Commuter Biennial in Miami, Florida. Lee is the first Idaho artist to participate in the Fountainhead residency in Miami, Florida. She lives and works here in Boise, where she is an associate professor of sculpture at Boise State University. Outside of work, Lily enjoys running and listening to music. That seems to be we've heard a lot of musicians today. And so without any further ado, I will turn it over to Miss Lily Lee.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here. I appreciate everyone here taking the time on this beautiful Saturday to join me and hear a little bit about my work. So before I kind of get right into the screen share, I'm going to just show something that I'll refer back to later. So as you'll see, I work in textiles primarily at this point. And so I use just a 3-ring binder as kind of, it's the traditional alternative to a sketchbook that textile artists tend to work with. You can have dye samples and swatches of yarn and things like that in there. And so it's a different kind of methodology, and I'll refer back to that later, but I just wanted to show that before I get into the screen share. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So today I have a lot of slides I'm going to be going through, and I'm really focusing on my current body of work, which is actually a collaboration, and I'll get into more details. And one kind of big theme that I want to share is that I tend to think through my content going from specific too broad, and that tends to be a little bit different than how a lot of education is structured with things like scaffolding assignments. There's this emphasis on kind of like narrowing down an idea, and that's the inverse of how I naturally think and get excited about things. So you'll kind of see as I talk about my work, I'll talk about it more through like how I do things, how I think about things, how I experiment, how I work with materials. And so hopefully that will help, but I think some context can be beneficial for that. So yes, this body of work is called the Great Basin Murders. So it is a series I'm working on, it's ongoing, looking at unsolved homicides from the 70s through the 90s in the Mountain West region. And the common theme I'm looking at is cases where women were found kind of dumped along roadways and highways. They're all basically either unsolved or the victims are unidentified in the cases I'm looking at. So it's obviously a really sensitive topic, and there's a lot of consideration I have to put into with that. So I'll be sharing these pieces going chronologically of when the cases occurred, but it's not actually what order I made the work in. So this is Star Valley Jane Doe, who was found, her body was found in 1972 in Death, Nevada, so kind of outside of Elko. 2 ranchers found her body. So you can see this map of the actual site. So in this, with my research into this case, I actually got to meet the son of one of the ranchers who initially found her. And so I know that this is the exact location. I don't have that amount of knowledge with every case, but you can see here, it's all dirt roads. And then there's this like well and pump kind of up on this crest of a hill. And so this woman's body was found down there. And the less pronounced kind of more direct road is what they usually use. They had to check this pump daily to make sure it was irrigating and, you know, providing water for the cattle at the time. But this more kind of longer route was if you had a trailer and you needed, it wouldn't navigate the more steep route. So it was very uncommon to even be here and very unusual for a nude deceased woman's body to be found there. Very odd, specific place. So here I was able to visit the actual site. You can see those utility poles are like where the pump is. So I did a lot of research. This case just struck me as so just tragic. That is such a harsh place to be left nude for dead. She was shot twice, I guess, before she was left. But they still have not identified who she was. It's still completely unsolved. And that made me really curious. And I wanted to, thinking about that vulnerability of being left there, made me want to make a shroud for her. So I kind of, this figured out that method. And this actually was the first project I did because it was maybe the case with the least physical details. So here is kind of my where my research method starts. So I look at factors like age, height, weight, and GPS of approximately where the victim was found. And I use that information to develop a weave structure. And I do that with a software program. So this is kind of complicated, but on the upper right-hand corner, that grid is the tie-up. You'll see in the next slide kind of what that means a little bit. And then the part on the right-hand side going vertically is the treadling sequence. And then the part going along the top is the heddle threading sequence. So when I start a weaving project, I use this equipment, which is called a warping mill, to wind all of my warp in a particular length and a particular quantity. And then I dress the loom. So this is the loom I use. And I actually wind all of that warp yarn onto there. And then I thread it through the heddles in that sequence. So this is from that grid image, the thing along the top. And that's where I put the data from the case. So it's only a 4-shaft loom. So that what that means is, like, you can see along the top, there are 4 of those frames with all these little kind of like hook or hole, you know, heddles coming down with the holes. So each warp yarn goes through one, and they're assigned these numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, going back. So then I use those numbers to, in some cases, add up to totals, or in some cases go with digits. So like for GPS, it's digits. For like height, weight, and age, it's totals. And so I kind of created a system for how I did that to be consistent across the body of work. But it basically means that when you think about these metaphors of fabric and identity, it's actually woven into the structure. And I love that about weaving, that there's each yarn is engaged and necessary to create the structure, but then they're also creating their pattern. So there's this really kind of nice unification that is really exciting for me. Here's a detail, so you can see a little bit more from that slide with the pattern, kind of how that turned out. So this case was really just a nude woman. There was a little bit of information about some scars, so just physically like stitched kind of in those locations. And I think about this somewhat as a body. So the height is the length of the weaving is accurate to the height of the woman, and tried to just include as many details as I could. But as you'll see through some of the other projects, that get more complex, there's more details. So this one was Devil's Gate Jane Doe, who was found near Elko in 1972 as well. So just a few months after Star Valley Jane Doe. So you can see actually here, I mapped out kind of both sites. So they're actually kind of close. So this area is really bizarre. It's kind of a housing development that never happened. So it's all gridded out, but there's no utilities. And that's just kind of all like dirt roads kind of cut into the desert. There are some like structures people live in, but it's not like a developed area. This is a commemorative brick. That's kind of a different project I did in as part of this, but I'm actually kind of overlooking the area where this case was found. I was not able to access it because it was private property. So here's a newspaper article from the time. And so in my research, I noticed a lot of discrepancies too, and I have to really dig deeper and kind of read between the lines. So this one was pretty tragic because she was obviously quite young. And so each case, as I work through these, kind of tears at me in a different way, and it compels me to want to keep going and doing more. So this one was very sad, just in how young she was. So here you can see there's no estimate for weight because of the remains being partial, and so I kind of just put in a spacer, like that blank area is to indicate that. And you'll see in the pattern, the resulting pattern here, these long floats are basically where there's that missing data about weight. And then this section in this middle that's kind of missing is to indicate that the torso was not found. And then I applicate on these sweater remnants as described. And here's in process on the loom. That kind of, I did some stitching to kind of make sure that the warp would not, or the weft would not drift from where I had kind of ended it. So here's some photography done really, really close to on site, kind of public land as close as we could get. And I should mention, so the photographs are taken by Quinney, who I collaborate with. And another factor is she actually visits these sites trying to get as close as possible to the correct time of year for when the women were found. So the first case I showed, she was found in July. This one was found in October. So that's why you'll see the difference in the vegetation and the snow on the mountains. So Thousand Springs Jane Doe was found in Wilkins, Nevada, which is on 93 between Jackpot and Wells. And it was a tourist couple had pulled over there. It's another kind of very specific, odd site. So there's a lot of this weird debris there. There used to be a service station and a motel there, but they had both actually burned down before 1974 when this young woman was found. So again, very young. And some other details were that the body had been burned. So I showed that by actually physically burning the weaving and then also appliquing on burnt material. And so at the time that I made this, I could not find information about the color of the clothing. Later, I learned that there was color, but when I made this, I kind of just used what information I had. And that's how I have to approach all of this. There's a lot of problem solving and decision making, looking at things like missing information and how do I treat that? How do I navigate that? So here's again some photos on site. So you can see 93 there off in the distance. So with the body of work, I started out really looking at Jane Does. They have this mystique, this mystery that I'm really curious about, this lack of identity. And then, so by making the shrouds, I'm metaphorically giving them back, hopefully some gesture of respect by creating this covering for their bodies metaphorically. But I'm also interested in how through the textile, the actual construction of the cloth on the loom, I'm able to also somewhat try to develop their identity or use what identifiable information there is to create this artistic piece. I transitioned or expanded the body of work to include cases where the women were identified, but that otherwise kind of fit similar criteria. And in some ways, these are actually more forgotten. So there's definitely kind of like a fringe following or interest in Jane Doe's. There's that mystique, right? And so with cases where the woman was identified, but then it's just a cold case, unsolved homicide, they tend to actually kind of get less information. So this one is based on Cora Carrillo. So her body was found outside of Carson City, Nevada in 1981 here off of Jacks Valley Road. So a motorist pulled over to take photographs of the mountains and found her body there. And so there's all of this information about her clothing. And then there's also, for creating the pattern, what I did was I changed it from being all of those details like height and weight and age and things like that with the Jane Does. I switched it to being just the date of birth and date of death to kind of be more of this like memorial. And I also made the ones for identified women a little bit larger to kind of be more like a functional shroud that could envelop someone as opposed to like representing a body. I did still do it accurate to the height. And then I used those details about the clothing in developing the work. So I hand dyed all of the weft yarn to be brown. She was wearing a brown sweater, and blue to go with her denim jeans. And then I also stitched, she was wearing cowboy boots. So I stitched on that kind of like classic pattern of what would be on the toe of a cowboy boot and included some chain to, you know, reference the necklace she was wearing. And so here you can see on the right, my hand-dyed skeins, and then the way the pattern lays on the loom with the color is based on how that dye process was done. So each skein I kind of had half in this blue and half in this brown. And so working with Carrie, we have throughout the body of work kind of come to think of the photography as kind of the final product, if you will. So the weaving is just one step, and we're able to use this photographic process and the staging somewhat to kind of include more information. So this woman was found strangled with an article of clothing. So we Carrie bunched up the weaving on one end. So we try to look at like how the body was physically found to include that. But we also don't want that to be like graphic or gory. We want it to be still a respectful textile. So it's a fine line, a lot of discretion and trial and error. And Carrie takes a lot of photos at each site. So some where it's less pronounced to try to make sure that it's still respectful. You can see some housing in the background. So it's kind of brazen that someone pulled over and did this with, and I believe that housing was there at the time. So another woman who was identified, and this was actually the first identified one I did, was Ermelinda Garza. So she was found kind of in St. George, Utah, in this area, which I believe at the time a lot of that development was not there yet. Kind of trying to look on Google Earth, it looked like a lot of those buildings were not there probably. It's kind of an industrial area. And there's discrepancy. It was either a landscaper or a resident collecting rocks. Either way, it was a local man found her there. It said that she was partially clothed, but there was no information about the clothing. And so for this one, what I did for color was I looked at what information I had. So I did find her date of birth and date of death just through like genealogical research. And I went ahead and used the birthstone as kind of the color inspiration. So that being garnet, being that her birthday was in January, I did a lot of dye samples here on regular cotton fabric to try to match that color. And then I have a little short video here of some of my process, how it goes. So I have the skein and then I'm winding it onto a bobbin here. So there's a lot of repetition physically in the weaving process. So for your students, it can be a great medium for students that like to work that way. You can see there's also a lot of applied math, not only with like how all of this yarn goes on the loom, but also the proportions and that kind of like problem solving with the dyeing here. And that's why I use a binder instead of a sketchbook too, is just because it's the most suitable way to kind of keep all of this organized. And I have to look back at it constantly of, okay, now need to dye another batch of this. What was that recipe that ultimately got the color I wanted? And here that is on the loom in progress. So in this particular case, so we've done it where Carrie actually travels to the locations, the physical actual locations whenever possible, but with COVID, that's been a little bit challenging. And then also they're really remote, really spread out throughout the region. So this is actually not St. George. This is kind of near Micron. So we try to find areas in the valley that look close, and we spend a ton of time examining these Google Earth images and trying to kind of find what would look the most similar in terms of like the distance of the mountains in the background, and then within the vegetation, usually it's like what is the ratio of like dead grass to sagebrush that's gonna kind of get the right look of these different sites. This is also not the actual site in Rock Springs, Wyoming. This is local, but I think Carrie did a great job capturing that amount of grass that would be accurate. So in this case, this is Bitter Creek Betty. So this one was found actually quite a ways outside of Rock Springs in 1992. So it's just a pull-off known as Bitter Creek. There's a rest stop at another exit there. And so there's some information here. So it was a truck driver had pulled over and like saw her body kind of down this slope. One piece of information is, so detectives initially thought she was Native American, and then they later, through DNA and analysis, found out that she was of European and South American descent. So you can see the pattern here using my same method. And so with looking at race, that's always challenging in art with representing people in any way. In this case, when I made the work, that DNA information was not available yet, but there was speculation that she was Native American or Hispanic or white or multiracial or biracial, was kind of how it was described in an anthropological terms. So I decided to approach it as though trying to represent that she may have been biracial. So I did that with dyeing, like using tea dye on half of the yarn to try to show some sort of like biracial identity. So that's a real sensitive, challenging thing, but it's part of the information. So it's really important for me to include that. So here's some artistic renderings, forensic information, and then also an image of the tattoo. Trying to decipher how that was on the body. I didn't think probably that's what I thought probably that whoever uploaded the photo had probably done it upside down. So I actually rotated it on my weaving just based on like stylistically, like how the signature looked. But I have to do so many weird decision-making things as I translate all this information into a textile. So I did the tattoo through embroidery here, kind of starting with the outline and then filling in with color. So actually embroidering on top of the weaving I had done. So here's another detail in the simulation of the site. So it said, in this case, she was found with sweatpants in proximity to the body. So How does that translate, right? So I've kind of put those like perpendicular to how they would be worn, and then cut one pant leg into strips and wove it. It never said what color the sweatpants were, so I just made sure it was an unremarkable color. In this case, I found navy blue ones at the thrift store. They could have been black, they could have been gray, but I think if they were a more unique color, it would have said. So some information is very detailed and some is not in these kinds of forensic information I'm looking at. So this is I-90 Jane Doe, found the same year on the opposite end of Wyoming, or all the way north, near Sheridan, close to the Montana border. So you can see they're really close to the border. Here's some artistic renderings of this woman. With some of them, there's a huge variation. With this one, it seems pretty consistent. Like, I think if detectives figured out who she was, it would make a lot of sense, probably. We would be able to say, yes, that looks like her. This case was really sad because she was actually pregnant at the time she was found, 10 weeks. So I included that in the weaving. Here's the pattern. And it said that it sounded to me in the description like the pants had been kind of like put back on the body. So that's what this is trying to show. And so with the pregnancy, it said that she was 10 weeks along, and I looked it up, and at that point, basically the fetus would be the size of a strawberry. So I did that with double weave just to show that kind of like second being of identity in there, kind of in the abdomen area. It's very subtle. Viewers don't notice it. So here's a video of the actual weaving process. So again, I think weaving's a great option for people that like repetition. So here you can see the photograph again on site that Carrie did. This is a simulation as well. This is actually near Caldwell, not Sheridan, but I think she got a great likeness. And so this case and the other one from Wyoming, the last one, Bitter Creek Betty, just in about a year ago now, an arrest actually was made, or a man was charged with these two cases. So they're solved as far as who killed these women. It was a truck driver from Iowa who was, through genetic genealogy, traced back to him. However, they're still unidentified. They're still Jane Doe's. And so that, for me, is an interesting thing about working with this subject matter, is that these are living cases, if you will. I mean, it's all about deceased people, but there's this continued story as far as the investigation and all of that ongoing process and research. Hopefully they'll be identified through the same technological processes with the genetic genealogy. So this is Shafter Jane Doe. She was found near West Wendover, Nevada in 1993. So you can see wells there. Oasis is pretty much just like a thing that used to be a gas station, but so it's funny what gets labeled here in some of these rural areas. But yeah, you can see so Shafter is actually just a pull-off. It's, yeah, just a pull-off, no amenities or anything. So in this case, it was a geologist from California was pulled over to stretch his legs and was kind of wandering around the sagebrush, and then found this woman's body kind of in this area. So you can see a lot of information here. And out of all of the cases, this was probably the one who was found the most recently after she was dumped. So not a lot of decomposition. So it seems like it should have been solvable. And one couple things. So this was the second project I actually did, and it was because I was really interested in some similarities between this and the first one I showed, Star Valley Jane Doe. So they both were found nude. Their bodies were both supposedly posed in kind of a cross-like position with one hand outstretching west and the head facing the other way. And they were also both shot twice. So I just thought that is so uncanny that these women's bodies were found in the same position 21 years apart. But after talking to the son of the rancher who found Star Valley Jane Doe, I am less convinced because he described the body differently. But at any rate, so here's the pattern for Shafter Jane Doe. And in this one, nude, right? Not a lot of details. There was information that she was wearing pink nail polish. However, it didn't say if that was on the toes or the fingers or both. So I just did on one. And I tried to research what types of nail polish or what colors were popular in 1993 to kind of figure out the right kind of pink. But it was challenging. And so here's another photo by Carrie. So she was found November 16th, 1993. So again, you see the snow to kind of go with that time of year. And you can kind of see how the photos really create this narrative quality, right? So you can imagine you're a geologist from California and you're walking here and you see maybe just the legs of a woman. And so the photos really set the scene and create this narrative, and that site specific quality of, and this was the actual site that really, I think, adds a lot to the work that a weaving alone couldn't really do. So this is the most recent one I finished. So this is Tina Cherie Snell. So she was also found near West Wendover in 1996. So she was found kind of more right on the border by two hunters from Utah. And with this one, I actually was able to get a lot more information by researching and kind of collaborating or getting information from the coroner. And so she was identified. So you can see here a photo of her, but she was identified. So her body was found more like a year after she had died. And it was partially mummified. But there was a fingerprint on this leather travel bag that was found near the body. So from that is how she was identified. And she was not local to the area. She had been previously arrested in Texas and Oregon. So she was kind of all over the place, but not local to Nevada. So you can see, again, I did the pattern based on date of birth and date of death. And in this case, so her birthday is just 5 days apart from mine. So I kind of used my own taste a little bit more in this one. With some of the others that were identified, I tried to think about what their personality or disposition may have been like based on astrology, because I didn't have a lot else to go on. But so this one, she was found with a swimsuit underneath her clothing, but detectives initially thought it was lingerie. So I have these cutouts that are supposed to represent that kind of ambiguity. It was black, and there were layers of lace and solid. And then she was wearing a black t-shirt, but I thought about what would a black t-shirt look like after a year in the desert for that one color, and then jeans. So I was looking at like popular denim colors in 1996 for kind of doing this dyeing. A lot of experimentation. And then also how would the denim fade, right? It probably wouldn't fade as quickly as a black t-shirt, but it would definitely be a more muted color. And she was found at this kind of under an outcropping of rocks, is how it was described. So in kind of a fetal position. So Carrie, took care to kind of tuck it in that kind of method. So this is Tanya Tusk. So this is the only Idaho case in the series, but that was part of what initially made me interested in these stories of these women, was because it connected to Idaho. There's a ton of true crime out there, and I wanted to look at these really forgotten cold cases and think, how can I, as an artist, share this information in a way that's respectful, that helps to get more attention, and keep these stories alive, and kind of heat up these cold cases, but in a way that's not exploiting them, but that's more honoring them, and providing, through the artistic process of weaving. Weaving is kind of a manifestation of labor. So there's already just physically and in terms of time, some of that naturally in the process, but then also how I like think about and treat these details. I'm just trying to think about how I can do that. So Tanya Tusk, her body was found in 1997, so kind of outside of Idaho Falls, on an on-ramp, or to the side of an on-ramp. So you can see a sketch here and then a photo after she was identified. And I think that artist did a really good job with that rendering. I can see a similarity there. It looks like Bonneville County was using a typewriter still in 1997. I like that kind of like archival quality of some of this. So she was found with one silver ring with a mother of pearl in it. And it said later on that she usually wore silver jewelry. So I used that information. Then here's the pattern based on date of birth and death. So there's a lot of emphasis given with her hair color. So you can kind of see back here, it's like bleached, and it's described as like orange, or this kind of like really obvious bleaching. So I physically did that to the work. So I started with orange yarn as my weft, and then I actually bleached it. So I use soft scrub because it's already thickened, so it kind of can work more like paint. And then you just have to neutralize it by rinsing it and then soaking it in a mild vinegar solution, to kind of have the acid, kind of neutralize the base, and then you can rinse it. So that's actually an easy low-tech process that you can do with students. So I did it as this kind of border, and then you can see kind of over on the left, there's some nylon in the warp on this one, and that's to indicate that she normally wore silver jewelry, but wasn't at the time other than that ring. And then I used freshwater pearls in the fringes, which is what this is kind of a process photo of, to try to kind of reference the ring, but I went with the freshwater instead, kind of aesthetically. So here you can see the piece finished. You can see more of that silver stripe. And so this is a simulation of this site. Carrie's going to go to Idaho Falls soon. She actually has family there. But this was, we were trying to find an area with a storage unit in the background, because that's, there at that on-ramp where she was found. So that was actually it as far as the most recent case. However, this is a continued series that I'm working on. So each project I do, it makes me feel bad about not including others, right? So as I research all of these cold cases, there are some that don't seem to fit, right? Maybe the women were much older, right, than some of these cases where they're quite young. Maybe but I keep expanding it, right? So at first I was looking at ones that were all nude, or just in northern Nevada. And now I'm just kind of like looking, the more I look, the more cases I see. And there's this really large pattern or phenomenon. And it's definitely not like all one serial killer, I don't think, that, especially with this kind of range of year and locations, but it's more this repeated pattern of these women being left discarded in these horrible, harsh environments, and being forgotten today. And that's kind of really what drives the work. So as I make more, then each one I learn about through this kind of archival research with the old newspapers, the more I want to continue and do more. So I have some resources.
I'm sorry, Lily. There's a question in the chat. Do you get reactions from family members of the victims?
That's a good question. I haven't so far. I didn't start doing the cases where they were identified until less than a year ago. And so we'll see. if anything comes of that, but I am prepared. I've done other work with cold cases, not through weavings. Actually, it was with car hoods, but I've handled that in that way, and so I'm prepared, and I kind of hope it happens. Actually, right? Like I would like to see this work connect, and so far I've been able to, like I said, speak to the son of the rancher who found one of the women. If the family members did not like it, right, if they did not think it was respectful, I would definitely just like remove that case or that project from any display of the work out of respect. If they liked it, I would give them the work if they wanted to have it as a memorial. But yeah, I'm always curious about that. And I'm also exhibiting the work in the locations, right? So I showed the work in Elko. Now I'm showing the work in Reno, starting in 4 days. So if survivors of Cora Carrillo are around, hopefully they'll see that or hear about that. Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, so for anyone who is interested in maybe exploring weaving in terms of something they could bring into their curriculum, there's a lot of resources. And so there's the Hand Weavers Guild of America and the Surface Design Association are both national. And then regional is ANWIG, and that includes the Western United States and part of Western Canada. And then in state, we have a number of guilds, but these are like, some of these are really small, like the Orofino Guild, I think only currently has 4 members. So just keep in mind, it's a volunteer thing with Weavers Guilds, but part of their mission usually, or at least the Hand Weavers Guild of Boise Valley that I'm a member of, right? Part of our mission is education and like keeping this hand weaving process alive. So there's been a huge renaissance in the last probably 15 years of fiber art and textile art in the contemporary art context. But there's also this history that's very rich, and it's this kind of like special traditional process that less and less people have access to. So keeping that alive is a really big mission. So there can be an opportunity for collaboration. There are also more formal educational programs. So Idaho State University offers a BFA in fiber media and papermaking. At Boise State, I teach I teach a course as part of the sculpture curriculum, focusing on flexible form, where we do hand weaving, in addition to other kind of soft sculpture, dyeing, different surface design processes. One big tip is that used equipment can become available through the hand weaving community very easily. I compare it to exercise equipment, right? Like people think they buy this large thing, they think they're going to use it frequently, and then they don't. And then a hoodie's draped on it, and then the rest of the family wants their dining room back, and then they have to get rid of it. It's really common. So used weaving equipment is actually pretty easy to find. It takes a while because it's so specialized to find the one you want, but it makes this not that expensive of a thing to get going. The materials are also cheap. So actually with that whole body of work, the white yarn that I used as the warp on all of my work, and then on the Jane Doe's, all of the weaving is actually free from Bigelow Tea. So it's rejected tea bag string. So just what connects the bag to the label. So it's really easy to do financially. So at Boise State, I teach in sculpture. So I wanted to make a really quick plug. Now we're at time here, but just wanted to share that students tend to come into college a lot of times with a really solid understanding of, say, like what painting is or what photography is. And sculpture, it's a little bit more complicated because it's so broad. So it's really like anything 3D can be sculpture. And so our curriculum at Boise State is that we, in the beginning level, focus on casting, wood assembly, and metal fabrication. So 2/3 of the curriculum is in the shops with tools. And then in the intermediate level, we continue with fibers, which connects to my individual practice in soft sculpture. But we also do foundry casting. We have a foundry where we cast with bronze. We do a lot of mixed media, installation, ephemeral work, site-specific work, which connects also to my practice, and then also carving and 3D printing and using other digital fabrication. So sculpture might be a great option for students who like to work with a variety of materials, like to do 3D problem solving, think through and express ideas three-dimensionally. And it's also great for students who like tools and making noise and messes. That's sculpture. And then I have some student work images here from the different curriculum. So you just kind of get an idea. So a lot of things can count as sculpture. And I think it's helpful in like K through 12 education to start to just use that word, right? Like if a student has a 3D project, just call it a sculpture when you're critiquing things, and it might kind of reinforce that. And then I have just a link about our program, and then also an Instagram handle, which I manage, that shares what we do here in sculpture at Boise State, as well as my kind of individual studio Instagram and my website, which I need to update soon. Some of the work I showed was not on there yet. So I wanted to stop the share and see if anyone had any other questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Lily. That's amazing, all of the different thought and dedication you put into finding information about these cases. I had a question. How long does it take for you to create one piece from the start of researching all the way through the weaving process to finally the photography process?
That's a great question. So I've developed that, throughout the body of work. So setting up the loom takes probably, just winding the warp takes like 4 hours. Putting it on the loom, threading the heddles, that's another couple days. So physically doing the work takes probably, if I say like we're not doing it on top of a day job, probably a month or a few weeks. The research, I've hit a lot of walls, but then I've also had some amazing success. So that is just really up to the disposition of whoever answers the phone. If I call a coroner's office, sometimes I've made like really great connections. Sometimes I've kind of received some terse responses. So, and then the newspaper archives, so the museum that I exhibited at in Elko has historical archives through the newspapers there. So if it's a case from Elko County, I have great access. But our library at Boise State, all of our kind of newspaper archives don't go back that far, or through like the kind of like services. So then it's a little bit more limited. So the research is really different from one to the next based on those kinds of factors. But yeah, good question. Okay. So I see thank you, what I see in the chat. Yeah.
Now, Lily, I think, what is most powerful for me is how respectful you are of the voice of the people who no longer are able to speak their own voice, right? And that idea that, just the way in which you're talking about the respect for those victims. I'm not sure, the people. But I think it's also, I think there's some parallels there maybe with what we need to do for our students, right? We need to give them some voice and provide them opportunities, right, to speak when sometimes they can't. So I do think that is a nice parallel with what we're working on. Deborah has a question about whether you personally get emotionally overwhelmed.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely do at the locations. For me, there's something about being there and knowing that happened there, and then looking at the things that, not the litter and stuff that's recent, but like the mountains that were there the whole time, or like a rusty fence or something that was there the whole time. That for me can be really, really profound. I haven't been able to visit all of the sites yet, but that process, the site specific for me, is what's the most emotionally charged. I think with the weavings, there's definitely points where some of the details also are what really get me. And so I think working through that like specific to broad like method and then all of these details, translating that into the work, in some ways, it can get more technical, but at the same time, it's those details that are what's so charged. So trying to include all of those is really important for me for the work to have that depth. Good question.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us today, Lily, and I appreciate everyone being kind of engaged in this conversation. It is a heavy topic, but I think it is really interesting for us to think about ways to interpret data, to tell stories, and to be sort of historically connected. I do want to, again, big round of applause for Lily and her time. We're also appreciative of that.